Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. Now that we've dealt with the Sino-Soviet split in the previous two episodes, in today's episode we're going to be turning back to China's domestic politics. Now that we've moved into the 1960s, you're probably expecting that we'll soon be talking about the most famous event in China's modern history, the Cultural Revolution. But just hold your horses there, because while we're on the road to the Cultural Revolution, we've still got a bit of a way to go before we can actually start talking about the event itself in any substantial way. First, we've got to get through the post-leap years, roughly 1961 to 1966, to figure out what exactly was going on in China and how we ended up on the train to the complete social and economic upheaval that gripped the country for a decade. The years 1961 to 66 are a fairly muddy part of China's history. The economy was in tatters after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, which caused both economic collapse and famines with exceedingly high death tolls. If you were someone who was partial to logic, you'd probably think to yourself, wow, that was a really bad situation. At least this country isn't very likely to fall into the grips of yet another ideologically driven scheme with no real structure that would threaten the very fabric of society. And yet you'd be wrong, because the Cultural Revolution was just such a scheme. Perhaps a sensible nation would have gotten rid of the leader who almost caused their downfall, and indeed Mao was sidelined very heavily and was not allowed to touch the economy with a barge pole in the immediate aftermath of the leap. But that's only the first part of the story. I don't think it was certain at any point that the Cultural Revolution was going to take place for sure. One of the things it came down to was a clash between a new emergent leadership and Mao, two groups that wanted completely different things. Mao wanted to continue the revolution, while the more moderate planners wanted to rebuild the economy and build up China slowly. These economic issues became ideological issues, as the two cannot be understood separately in a socialist system. In China, economics is political, just like cultural production was political, which we had discussed in the episodes about the writers during the 100 Flowers movement and the anti-rightist movement in the mid-1950s. Every facet of the nation, especially in the first few decades of the PRC, was to work in service of the creation of the socialist nation, under the auspices of the party. Mao felt that people like Deng Xiaoping and Liu Xiaoqi were deviating from this line, and sought to correct it using politics, as he'd lost control of the economic realm. How and why they were deviating is the topic of today's episode. So, over the course of the next two episodes, we're going to be discussing this deep rift in the leadership of China, and how the battle between two opposing ideologies basically served as a prelude to the Cultural Revolution. In this episode, we'll look at the struggles of moderate leaders, like Deng and Liu, to recover the economy while fighting Mao's influence. In the next episode, we'll talk about Mao's comeback, his rallying of support from his base, and the launch of the socialist education movement as a sort of build-up to the Cultural Revolution. A major question that I hope to answer over the course of these episodes is how it was that China seemed to be going in one direction, but ended up going down a completely different path of personality cults, mass hysteria, and self-destruction. How is it that despite their ability to win the economic sphere, and the general decline in Mao's prestige, that the planners still lost out in the end, leading many of them to be purged and even killed during the Cultural Revolution? First, let's set the scene by talking about what exactly happened immediately after the Great Leap Forward. We discussed in the final episode of the Great Leap Forward series that the initial changes to policy to combat the effects of the grain shortage were introduced in 1960. The Urgent Directive on Rural Work was approved in November, and transferred decision-making powers from the inefficient communes to the smaller brigade units, which enabled a tighter management system and the introduction of incentives once again. This was just a temporary stopgap measure, however. The heads of the party knew that a long-term plan for recovering and developing the rural economy needed to be formed, and China could no longer rely on socialist fervour or the whims of the supreme leader in order to effect change. Chen Yun, the economic brains of the planners faction within the top leadership, was asked to come up with a viable plan. His strategy was bold and far-reaching. He proposed that 30 million migrant workers be resettled in the countryside so as to take the pressure off urban centres to provide food rations and to increase the rural labour force. He also suggested that the goals of manufacturing be changed from a focus on heavy industry to a focus on consumer goods and light industrial goods that could improve farming, as well as developing a chemical fertilizer industry to support this effort further. In terms of farming itself, he basically encouraged a reduction in socialist-like practices, arguing for the return of market forces in the rural economy and suggesting that different areas take up specialization in certain crops based on local advantage and interregional trade. These suggestions were a radical departure from pretty much everything the party had been pursuing so far, and so it took some convincing before Chen was able to pass any of these measures. One of the ways in which the planners group sought to convince others that this new direction in economic planning was a good idea was by carrying out investigations in rural communities. These investigations, mainly carried out in 1961, showed that cadres were continuing to mismanage the situation and over-report grain production to the centre. There was a race against time. The state reserves of grain were running low, and even major urban centres such as Tianjin, Beijing, and Shanghai were struggling to keep up with the demand for food. But, despite the urgency of the situation, there were still those within the party who were unwilling to budge on the idea of a socialist economy. Most of the resistance to Chen's ideas of increased privatization and market economy in the countryside came from those who not only supported Mao and the initial leap, but who were also planning a new leap forward, which they were hoping to introduce in the third five-year plan, to be launched in 1963. They fought against the moderates' position of trying to develop slowly until 1965 by arguing that continuing to invest predominantly in heavy industry was the best path forward. It seems strange that there would still be such a faction within the party who were willing to back essentially the same scheme that had just failed and caused the deaths of millions of people, especially as they were still in the midst of that crisis during these debates. But I think part of the reason, at least quite a large part, that there were still so many staunch supporters of Mao and the leap was because of the failure of the party leadership to take any responsibility for the outcomes of the leap, therefore giving it the ability to just continue making plans as if nothing had happened. So, in early 1962, the party did seem willing to take at least some responsibility for the disaster, at least internally. At an internal meeting, Liu Xiaoqi made a speech in which he acknowledged that in some areas, 70% of the famine was man-made, while 30% was caused by nature. At the 7,000 Cadres Conference in January, Mao took responsibility for certain aspects of the Great Leap Forward that went wrong, particularly the backyard steel furnaces and the high planning targets and procurement quotas that led to the exaggeration of output reports by lower-level cadres. But, as we'll discuss a little bit later, most of the emphasis was put on wrongdoing at lower levels, with top leadership continuing to deny their role in the disaster. So, because there was so little acknowledgement that it was the ideas of the leadership themselves that had been the problem, not just the implementation of said ideas, it meant that both Mao's view on economics and that of the planners were continually given equal weight in discussions about China's future, which then had a knock-on effect on economic recovery overall, as we're going to see. In terms of politics more generally, the two factions were able to continue battling for dominance in leadership between 1961 and 1965. Though it seemed a sure thing that the moderate planners would win the war in terms of economics, we know that the Cultural Revolution did in fact take place, which means that in the end the moderates could not succeed when it came to the ideological battleground. To help us understand why, I think we should first start by going over who exactly the planners were, and also what their main goals were and why they were trying to achieve them. There were about 5 or 6 people in the Central Economic Planning Group, but I think we'll just look at 3 of them for now, partly because they feature the most and they have the most to say, and also partly because, in terms of remembering names, these guys are actually important beyond just the next couple of episodes. So, the first and most important member of the planners group was, of course, Liu Xiaoqi. Liu's revolutionary record spoke for itself, and his position within the party was quite clear. Mao had pegged him to be his successor, and had actually made Liu chairman of the party in 1959, a position in which he remained until 1968. Descriptions of Liu paint him as essentially a humorless and hard-working man. He was known for his cool-headedness and his well-preparedness, and would work all night long, answering a call from Mao no matter what time it came. He was known to be very principled, and worked closely with both Mao and Zhou Enlai, who was the premier, both formally and informally. By all accounts, he was very close with Mao on a personal level, despite the fact that he became a key target of criticism throughout the Cultural Revolution, especially for what became known as his theory of productive forces, which basically meant that he wanted capitalist markets to be in charge of the economy instead of socialist command economics. However, it was Liu who had stood in support of Mao at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward against people like Zhou Enlai and Chen Yun, which probably made his switch to the other side all the more painful in the 1960s for Mao. Although Liu was acknowledged as the chairman's successor, this period was definitely the start of a rivalry between the two, which would eventually come to a head in the Cultural Revolution. The second-ranking member of the group, Chen Yun, had a very clear and consistent vision for China's economy. Chen was from a genuinely poor working-class family and had developed an interest in class relations and the capitalist system as a young boy growing up near Shanghai. He made his mark at the Jiangxi Soviet, helping to set up imports of salt and medicine to the communist base and getting supplies for the Long March, after which Mao put him in charge of just the economy in general. By the time the party took power in 1949, Chen was the 5th-ranking party leader and took over responsibility for getting the ailing economy back on his feet. He was known for being cautious and responsible, and had once said, "Don't automatically accept what a superior says, don't automatically accept what a book says, accept only reality, exchange views, compare, and before concluding, go over the situation again and again." He was so careful in his planning, in fact, that actually during the first 5-year plan, which he was in charge of writing, he got in trouble with Mao because he kept delaying its release because he wanted to keep getting it more and more perfect. But ultimately, it was his careful and diligent approach that led to the success of the first plan, although now we know that Mao felt that the success was too moderate, hence the Great Leap Forward, so yeah, think of that what you will. Chen had actually been against the Great Leap Forward from the very beginning, saying that it would take at least 50 years to catch up with developed nations like Britain, not just 15, and he argued for the decentralization of capital allocation to the provinces. Even during the leap, he continued to criticize production quotas as unrealistically high and advocated for the reintroduction of private farming plots. He was always honest with Mao in private, but interestingly always avoided criticizing him in public, even when his point of view had the upper hand as it did in 1962. It seems like his focus was always on economic issues, not scoring political points, and he was also close to Mao, and had been close to him since the 1930s, so he knew when to press an issue and when to back off. He also suffered from poor health, often only working part-time due to a heart condition, and often being absent from important meetings, for example the Lushan Conference of 1959, where Peng Dehuai was dismissed. All of these factors basically meant that Chen was often sidelined when no one agreed with him, like during the Great Leap, and then he was sort of brought back to save the day once they realised that they needed somebody who actually knew what he was doing. He was like that friend that you go to when you want honest advice on a situation, but then you end up not actually taking their advice. Deng Xiaoping's role as a member of the planners group is not as concrete as the others. He wasn't in a position of great authority like Liu Xiaoqi, and his personal stakes in economics were not as clear as Chen Yun's. In fact, at this time, Deng Xiaoping was actually the most junior member of the group. In general, Deng was considered to be a pragmatic communist who was able to keep good relations with multiple parties at once. For example, he knew Zhou Enlai from his time studying and working in France in the 1920s, and he got on well with him. But he also knew how to get on well with Mao, and managed to keep up his relationship with Liu Xiaoqi and the other moderate members of the leadership just as well. If anything, Deng always comes off a little bit bland in the readings. As vice premier, general secretary of the party, and briefly minister of finance at various points throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Deng had a hand in all economic decisions between 1957 and 1966 in some way or another. But it seems like he never really had a unique point of view on the economy. He always had some pragmatic reading on the situation. For example, his statement, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," was actually made in 1962. He was effective, but ultimately his main skill was just following orders and being able to bend it whichever way the wind was blowing. When it came to the post-leap recovery plan, he carried out the policies with the same vigour and effectiveness as he had the actual Great Leap Forward. There's a quote from one of the readings that I was reading about him that says, "It is not unusual to find Deng on both sides of a single issue at different times. However, he is following the prevailing line without regard to his previous position. His record was one of unprincipled but effective implementation of whatever policies were adopted by the centre. He played a major role as manager, fixer, and enforcer under a wide variety of policy orientations." So this sort of flexibility was probably why he was able to outlast Liu Xiaoqi and many of his other comrades, and actually ended up running the country despite having also been purged during the Cultural Revolution. So if we just look at this sample of people from the leadership who formed the more moderate side of the party, we can see that there was a mixed bag in terms of personality type and motivation. Both Deng and Liu had had a change of heart about the economic situation after the leap, whereas Chen had remained steadfast in his views on the economy since the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic. Deng was a pragmatist and an organisation man. In other words, he was an effective bureaucrat who didn't let his personal principles get in the way of doing what needed to be done. However, they've all been described as hardworking and diligent, and it seems like it was this mix of personality types that made the group so cohesive at that particular time. But this turned out to be a setback, politically speaking, as Deng's capitulation and fair weather support, and Chen's lack of involvement in politics, meant that Liu didn't really have anyone in his corner when he was trying to counter Mao on the ideological front. But if we're talking purely in terms of economics, back in 1962, this group had the advantage when it came to fixing China's economy, and they began pressing this advantage at an enlarged workers' conference that took place in January of 1962. So I mentioned the 7,000 Cadres Conference briefly earlier, but it's worth going into detail as it sets the stage for the dynamic that was to play out between the top leadership from 1962 onwards. The conference was unusual in that so many delegates from different backgrounds were allowed to attend, and junior officials were allowed to sit in on and even take part in discussions that were usually held amongst top leadership behind closed doors, especially in the middle of such a turbulent period. The conference had been called because the 1961 measures had failed to launch a transformation in China's economy, and a more forceful push was needed to get the nation out of depression and starvation. Famine was still raging in many areas, grain production was still low, and industry had collapsed. Meanwhile, the political atmosphere was still tense following the recent anti-rightist purge of 1959, just a couple of years before. Mao, at least, seemed confident that the lower ranks of the party would continue to support him, and he was right in that no one openly attacked him or forced him to admit personal wrongdoing at any point during the conference. The lower-ranking cadres were incentivized by their own position. They had already lost face within their communities due to the failures of the leap, and they didn't want to risk their positions any further by going against Mao and possibly being purged. But that still didn't stop the conference from being a success for the planners group in terms of launching their new economic policies. Probably the most important part of this conference was the report that was prepared by Liu Xiaoqi, and also his speech, which was delivered on the 27th of January, which served as kind of a summary for the written report, which had been written in December of the previous year. The main purpose of the original drafted report was largely to put a positive spin on the Great Leap, pointing out the excesses, but defending the program as a whole and leaving out any necessary apportioning of blame. Like I mentioned, more effort was put onto shifting blame downwards, with Liu stating that the main problems of the leap had not been in their ideas or principles, but rather in their implementation. However, generally speaking, direct responsibility for the famine was put on the heads of local cadres, who were attacked by the upper leadership of the party for mistreating peasants, being self-serving, breaking the rules, and for their Guomingdang work style. Certainly there were overzealous cadres who lied and schemed in order to meet production targets and other quotas. But I think it's undeniable that they would not have been acting in this manner had there not been considerable pressure from the top to do so. Many of them had little to no education, especially those who worked in rural areas, and were just blindly following the leadership. Some of them even worshipped Mao as they'd been taught to do so by the party propaganda. The cadres at the local levels were the foot soldiers of the party, and therefore their actions can be taken as a reflection of the goals of the party in general. It's not like the famine was some isolated event. It required the majority of party cadres across the country to act in basically the same way at exactly the same time. Why or how would they be able to do this if not driven specifically by the party's own leadership? But this issue was sort of skirted around in Liu's report. Apart from talking about the Great Leap, Liu also listed 16 lessons to be learnt from that period and 10 aims for the party from 1962 onwards, including increasing agricultural and light industrial output, cutting back on construction, and reducing staff sizes. He also announced the introduction of a 10-year plan, with a set of figures that ended up being pretty much useless, due to the fact that the mechanisms for economic planning had not changed over the course of the past 10 years, and then the Cultural Revolution broke out about halfway through the plan anyway. Something else that Liu's report does is give a very lengthy, very specific exoneration of Mao, which I want to read you a little bit of right now. Quote, Comrade Mao Zedong penetrates very deeply and is very far-sighted with respect to problems of construction, just as he was with the problems of revolution. He's very good at analysing and summing up the experiences of the masses and carefully separating out mistaken things while supporting and promoting correct things. He's always reminded us that in the life of the party and of the state, we must support the principles of democratic centralism. In these past few years, he's always been the earliest to discover our shortcomings and errors. If all of us, many comrades, had grasped the thought of Mao Zedong better, and were good at utilising the methods of seeking truth from facts and investigation and research which he has consistently advocated, if we had sincerely implemented the guiding opinions which Mao Zedong had put forward at every critical moment, if we had truly, and not just formally, spread popular and party democracy, if we had correctly implemented the system of democratic centralism, then the various errors in our work in the past few years could have been avoided or greatly mitigated, or could have been corrected more swiftly after they occurred. Now, you can make of that what you will, but in general, this defence could and probably should be read as a defence of the government and CCP in general. In defending the central government, including Liu Xiaoqi himself, Mao also had to be defended. There were criticisms of schemes or ministries or specific provincial leaders that Mao had supported during the leap in Liu's report, which reflected on Mao to some extent, and which those in attendance would have recognised as being an admittance of wrongdoing on Mao's part, but the criticism was deliberately veiled and implicit. This sort of ties into the other point that Liu's report was trying to do, which was to tighten the centre's control over the party in general, while ironically also calling for an adherence to the principle of democratic centralism. So just in case you're not aware, in brief, democratic centralism should have meant that lower-ranking cadres and non-party members would be able to voice their concerns about any policies moving forward before a final decision is made, without fear of retribution, dismissal, or purging. However, in that same report, Liu called on all party members to obey the centre unequivocally. In the end, it was just a contradictory mess. But there were discussions about the report that were held after the first draft was released, which apparently turned into a lively and productive discussion. Many questioned how, if the party's general line were correct, it had managed to produce so many errors. Others were dissatisfied with the way blame was apportioned and wanted greater clarification on the next steps that the leadership was going to take. Concrete questions had yet to be addressed. What about the race against Britain's steel production? Was that still going on? Not everyone voiced their concerns aloud, but the general atmosphere was enough that Liu's written report had to be amended over an 8-day period, after which he gave the speech that summarised it. In the revisions, generally speaking, there was a little bit more blame put on the centre, while also reaffirming the fact that just because they were the driving force behind the movement, that doesn't mean that everyone now had leeway to start criticising the leadership. Liu's mention of Peng Dehuai was enough to convince anyone of that. Instead of rehabilitating his character, which he definitely should have been, and pointing out the fact that he had been right when he had pointed out the failures of the Leap back in 1959, Liu instead said that Peng had been purged not because he had criticised Mao, but because of his anti-party behaviour and his attempts to usurp power. The message was clear. The two modes of thought were still inseparable. Any criticism of Mao basically meant that you were a power-hungry lunatic. True dissent would never be tolerated. Liu's speech and newly revised report did indicate that other leadership would be standing up to Mao more often, however, especially when it came to the economy, despite the few real changes that were made to the actual inner workings of the party. Even in his own self-criticism, on January the 30th, Mao acknowledged that he was only willing to give way on certain issues if every single person in the Politburo Standing Committee disagreed with him. Any major criticism, and again blame for what happened during the Great Leap Forward, was reserved for those lower down, provincial party secretaries in places like Henan, Shanxi and Guizhou, who had led the rallying cries for greater procurement during the Great Leap and were subsequently severely affected by the famine. I really do think that Liu's report and speech at the conference were defining moments for the road to the Cultural Revolution. The staunch defence of the Great Leap Forward basically prevented the complete dethroning of Mao and essentially allowed him off the hook almost completely. This could have been a turning point, a moment for them to take accountability and to point out how Mao's cult of personality was damaging the growth and development of China. Instead, the moderates decided to be moderate, giving Mao a free pass and therefore allowing him the space to stage a comeback just a few years later at their own expense. It also left the majority of lower-ranking party members in confusion about the true extent of the Great Leap famine and what exactly the solution would be to the problems that they did know about. Essentially, the status quo remained unchanged. No one felt like they could criticise Mao, and this is the atmosphere in which the new economic policies had to be formulated. But despite the lack of accountability and Mao's managing to get out completely unscathed, the moderates still managed to push ahead with their new economic plan. Chen Yun had come up with a list of 6 essentials for fixing the economy, and looking at the 6 points, we can see that they were basically a chance for him to express himself and his general attitudes towards economic planning. So, number 1, He wanted a 10-year plan divided into 2 stages. First stage being recovery, and then the second stage being development with a more centralized control. The second point was to continue moving people out of the cities. The third point was to control cash flows to curb inflation. The fourth point was to ensure that 3 billion jin of soybeans would be delivered to 60 million urban residents every year. So that would be 3 jin of soybeans a month, or 20 grams of protein per day, basically just ensuring the subsistence of urban workers. The fifth point was to increase agricultural output, including cash crops for commodities, more tools, and more provincial models, not national models. And finally, he wanted a general shift in attention from industry to agriculture. These points not only reflected the actual situation of China, which was still technologically backwards, but they also reflected Chen's key goal of trying to achieve balance in the economy overall, especially in the short term. Speculating on gains in the long term, based on wishful thinking, was just not going to cut it. Apparently, Mao objected deeply to these suggestions at the time, but as Chen's ideas were met with overwhelming support from basically everyone else, he had no choice but to go along with it. Chen was also a bit perturbed at being made head of the finance and economics small group and tried to resign over the issue. But no one cared and no one listened to him, and Liu Xiaoqi basically forced him to stay. In accordance with Chen's outline, new targets were set for each sector of the economy to try and increase both food production and the production of consumer goods, while also reducing waste. Some of the new targets included 2 billion yuan worth of sneakers, chemical fertilizers, chemical industry products, hardware, nylon socks, and small and medium farm tools. More production in general of oil, grain, pork, tobacco, and cotton. A reduction in expenditure in administration, culture, and education, as well as state and mass organizations. And an increase in the number of high-priced goods, such as rare seafood, alcohol, watches, and bicycles. These goals reflected not only a desire to increase actual consumption of food, but also a desire to increase sort of consumer spending in order to get the economy back up and running again. So once the planners group had actually managed to put these plans into motion, what was their impact on the economy? Was China's economy able to recover in the period 1962 to 1966? The short answer is kind of. In agriculture, the output of grain had increased in real terms to get back up to 1957 levels. But because there had been a growth in the population of around 80 million people, despite the famine, this meant that per capita it fell well short of targets. Other areas showed stronger recovery, and by 1965, cotton output had exceeded pre-leap levels by 50%, rapeseed by 60%, and meat by 40%. This was helped by the fact that irrigated land had increased by around 6 million hectares between 1957 and 1965, with almost a quarter of them using mechanized pumps. I guess that was one good thing that came out of the drive for irrigation projects from the Great Leap Forward. Despite its total collapse, industry actually recovered faster and better than agriculture. Heavy industry output grew by 17% per year, with output of steel, electricity, and cement doubling that of the 1957 levels. Light industrial output increased by 27% per year, with stocks of consumer goods such as sewing machines and bicycles soaring like they never had before. Despite the withdrawal of Soviet experts and aid that we discussed in the previous episodes, China was able to make breakthroughs in new fields, such as in the production of crude oil, which by 1965 was being produced at a rate at 200,000 barrels per day, 10 times the amount of the mid-1950s levels. New refineries were also opened up throughout the early 1960s, meaning that by 1965, China was basically self-sufficient in oil production, no longer having to rely on imports from the Soviet Union. Similar leaps were made in the fields of natural gas, synthetic fiber production, and agricultural chemicals. Somewhat ironically, the Sino-Soviet split had actually made China a little bit more independent and savvy when it came to producing its own raw materials for development. Because of this slow but steady recovery, inflation was curbed and prices eventually began to drop back down, reducing the price of market goods in the countryside and stabilizing the cost of living in urban areas. Overall, Chen wasn't able to achieve his primary goal of leaning towards agriculture more than industry. This was partly because of Mao's resurgence in politics, which again we'll get to in the next episode, which heavily cut into Chen's seemingly revisionist policies in the countryside and promoted the typical communist attitude of industrialization first. Investment in agriculture actually dropped from 21.3% in 1962 to 14.6% in 1965, and would continue to decline throughout the rest of the decade into the 1970s. As Mao's push for a resumption of class struggle took hold in the countryside, the sensible economic plans of Chen and his comrades were promptly thrown to the curb. As usual, when he was no longer wanted, Chen simply stood aside instead of fighting his corner, and once again, the people who would suffer most for these decisions were the peasants themselves. So, as of 1965, China was on the road to recovery, at least in terms of not having the majority of the population on the verge of starvation and living in terrible conditions. So, where did it all go wrong? I think what we'll discover in the next episode and the subsequent episodes when we get to the Cultural Revolution is that all these discussions and all these changes in the economic situation really meant nothing if one didn't also have control over the political situation. As politics was so closely connected to economics and the social situation, there was really no escaping the fact that Mao's resurgence and his ability to control the narrative once again was really the thing that mattered. Again, going back to the conference, the 7,000 Cadres Conference in 1962, that was really the moment where people could have been like, right, Mao was wrong, we're not only taking the economy away from him, we're also taking away politics. But really, Mao's personal prestige was only dented. He still had control over the army, especially Lin Biao, which again, we'll discuss Lin Biao and the PLA in later episodes. He was still revered by the lower members of the party, and to be honest, he still struck fear into those in the leadership as well. No one really felt comfortable going against him directly. Well, when I say no one, I mean no one with any real power. As we'll see in the next episode, there were those who did try and stand up to Mao, intellectuals in particular, and they also tried to avoid ideological reformation that was introduced by Mao, as well as the socialist education movement, which mainly took place in the countryside but also affected urban intellectuals. As we'll see, however, their resistance was futile. Everyone's resistance was futile. It was unfortunate, but the economic changes that were made to China, the road to recovery, that was all tossed to the side once it became evident that Mao wanted to re-establish himself. And once he had made that decision, there was nothing and no one that could stop him. So that's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget that you can sign up to the Sinobabble newsletter by going over to Substack and searching for Sinobabble, or going to the sinobabble.com website. If you like the podcast, you can donate if you like, again by going to the sinobabble.com website and clicking on the donate button. You can give a one-off or monthly donation. Any amount is appreciated, or none at all. You can just continue enjoying the episodes for free. Don't forget you can also follow me on Twitter. I don't really do anything on there except for retweet stuff about China, but I guess it'll be handy if you wanted to keep up with